Have you ever woken up one morning and suddenly felt like a stranger in your own life? Everything you thought you wanted, the career, the relationships, the achievements, suddenly feels hollow, meaningless, like you've been living someone else's dream. You look in the mirror and wonder, who is this person staring back at me? And more terrifyingly, what have I been doing with my life? If this sounds familiar, you're not broken. You're not having a breakdown. You're having a breakthrough. And Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in psychology, would tell you that this crisis might be the most important thing that ever happens to you. You see, Jung discovered something radical about human development. He realized that the crisis we fear most, the moment when everything falls apart, is actually the moment when everything begins to come together. But not in the way you think, not in the way society tells you it should, in a way that's deeper, more authentic, more you than you've ever been before. Today, we're going to explore why Jung believed that psychological crisis isn't your enemy. It's your guide. It's your psyche's way of telling you that you've outgrown the shell you've been living in, and it's time to break free. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you really are, not who everyone else expects you to be. But here's what most people don't understand about this process. It's not a gentle, gradual awakening. It's a psychological earthquake that shakes the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about yourself. Think about it this way. For the first half of your life, you're essentially living by a script written by your parents, your culture, your society. You're told to go to school, get good grades, find a career, build relationships, accumulate achievements. You're told that happiness lies in external validation, in meeting other people's expectations, in fitting into the mold that's been carved out for you. And for a while, it works. You follow the script, you check the boxes, you might even succeed spectacularly, but then something happens, usually around your mid-20s, or your 30s, or your 40s. The script stops working. The mask you've been wearing starts to feel suffocating. The life you've built feels like a beautiful prison. This is what Jung called the encounter with the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the world. The persona isn't evil, it's necessary. It helps us function in society, maintain relationships, build careers. But problems arise when we become so identified with our persona that we forget there's a real person underneath it. We become so good at playing our role that we lose touch with who we actually are. Have you ever felt like you're performing your own life instead of living it? Like you're saying the right things, doing the right things, but none of it feels authentic? That's your true self knocking on the door of your consciousness, demanding to be heard. Jung observed that this usually happens in waves throughout our lives. The first major wave often hits in what we now call the quarter-life crisis, typically between ages 22 and 28. This is when the prescribed path of education and early career starts to feel empty. You might find yourself asking, is this it? Is this what I'm supposed to do for the next 40 years? The world tells you to push through, to be grateful for what you have, to stop being so entitled. But Jung would say something different. He would say that this restlessness, this dissatisfaction, this feeling that something is missing, it's not ingratitude, it's intelligence. It's your psyche recognizing that you're living someone else's life. The quarter-life crisis is particularly intense in our current era because we're bombarded with images of what our lives should look like. Social media shows us endless versions of success, happiness, and fulfillment. We compare our inner experience with other people's carefully curated external presentations. We feel like we're failing at life when actually we're just beginning to live it. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The anxiety you feel about your choices, the paralysis in the face of infinite possibilities, the fear that you're wasting your life. These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of awakening. They're your authentic self pushing against the constraints of borrowed dreams. Jung believed that the psyche has its own wisdom, its own timing, and sometimes that wisdom manifests as crisis. Because crisis forces us to pay attention. Crisis strips away the superficial and reveals what's essential. Crisis asks us the questions we've been avoiding. Who are you when nobody's watching? What do you want when you stop trying to want what you think you should want? This brings us to what Jung considered the most significant psychological event in human development, the midlife crisis. But before you roll your eyes and think about stereotypes of men buying sports cars or women suddenly changing their entire lives, let me tell you what Jung really discovered about this phenomenon. The midlife crisis isn't about age. It's about psychological development. It usually occurs when we've achieved some level of external success, but find ourselves feeling empty, restless, or profoundly dissatisfied. We've climbed the ladder only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. Jung called this the transition from the morning of life to the afternoon of life. He said that the goals and values that serve us in the first half of life, achievement, accumulation, establishment, become insufficient for the second half. The afternoon of life requires different priorities: meaning, authenticity, depth, connection to something larger than ourselves. But here's the crucial point Jung made. This transition doesn't happen smoothly. It happens through what he called a confrontation with the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've denied, repressed, or hidden away. The shadow contains everything we've decided is unacceptable about ourselves: our anger, our selfishness, our desires, our fears, our authentic reactions to life. For years, maybe decades, we've been presenting a polished version of ourselves to the world. We've been the good employee, the perfect partner, the responsible parent, the successful professional. But underneath this acceptable facade, our shadow has been growing stronger, and at some point, it demands to be acknowledged. This is why midlife crises often seem to come out of nowhere. The quiet, reliable person suddenly becomes rebellious. The people-pleaser starts setting boundaries. The rational, logical individual discovers their emotional or creative side. People around them say, "You've changed," often with disapproval. And they're right. Something fundamental has shifted. Jung would say, this isn't a crisis at all. It's an integration. It's the beginning of wholeness, because you can't become fully yourself while denying half of who you are. The shadow integration isn't about becoming selfish or irresponsible. It's about becoming complete. It's about accessing the full spectrum of your humanity. This process often involves what Jung called the encounter with the anima or animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. This isn't about gender roles or stereotypes. It's about psychological balance. Many men reach midlife and realize they've been disconnected from their emotional, intuitive, or nurturing sides. Many women realize they've been disconnected from their assertive, independent, or ambitious sides. The integration of these aspects often looks like crisis from the outside: the successful businessman who suddenly wants to paint, the devoted mother who decides to go back to school, the logical engineer who becomes interested in spirituality. Society often judges these changes as midlife foolishness, but Jung saw them as midlife wisdom. Now, let's talk about what Jung considered the most challenging aspect of this entire process: the necessary psychological breakdown. This might sound frightening, but Jung believed that some level of psychological breakdown is not only normal, but essential for real growth. Think about it. If everything in your life is working perfectly, if you're completely satisfied with who you are and how you're living, why would you change? Growth requires a certain amount of discomfort. Transformation requires that something in your current structure breaks down to make space for something new. Jung observed that people often experience this breakdown as a dark night of the soul, a period of deep questioning, despair, or existential crisis. You might find yourself asking questions like, what's the point of any of this? Why am I here? What does my life mean? These aren't signs of depression necessarily, they're signs of awakening. The breakdown often involves the dissolution of your old identity, the person you thought you were, the life you thought you wanted, the dreams you thought were yours. All of it comes into question. This is terrifying because identity gives us a sense of security, of knowing who we are in the world. When that starts to crumble, it can feel like psychological death. And in a way, it is. Jung believed that psychological growth requires a kind of death and rebirth. The old self, the one that was shaped by external expectations and unconscious patterns, has to die for the authentic self to be born. This isn't a metaphor, it's a real psychological process that can be accompanied by real grief, real loss, real fear. But here's what Jung wanted us to understand. This death is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter. The breakdown is breaking down the false structures so that something true can emerge. The crisis is clearing space for authenticity. The darkness is preparing the ground for a new kind of light. This is why Jung emphasized that we shouldn't try to avoid or quickly fix these periods of crisis. They're not problems to be solved, they're processes to be lived through. When we try to medicate the discomfort, distract ourselves from the questions, or rush back to our old patterns, we miss the transformation that's trying to happen. The individuation process that Jung described isn't a straight line, it's more like a spiral. You might think you've integrated your shadow, found your authentic self, and completed your transformation, only to discover new layers of yourself that need attention. You might successfully navigate your quarter-life crisis, only to find yourself facing new challenges at midlife. This isn't failure. It's the ongoing process of becoming human. Jung identified several key stages in this process. First comes the recognition that something is wrong, that the life you're living doesn't fit who you're becoming. Then comes the confrontation with your persona, the realization that you've been living behind a mask. This is followed by the shadow work, acknowledging and integrating the parts of yourself you've denied. Then comes the encounter with the anima or animus, balancing the masculine and feminine aspects of your psyche. And finally, there's the ongoing relationship with what Jung called the self, the deeper, more authentic version of who you are, connected to something larger than your individual ego. But what does this actually look like in practice? How do you navigate these transitions without losing yourself completely? Jung offered some practical guidance for this process. First, he emphasized the importance of paying attention to your symptoms, your restlessness, your dissatisfaction, your strange new interests, your unexplained emotions. These aren't problems to be eliminated. They're messages from your unconscious, trying to guide you toward wholeness. Instead of fighting them, get curious about them. What are they trying to tell you? Second, Jung advocated for what he called active imagination, a practice of dialoguing with the different aspects of your psyche. This might sound mystical, but it's actually quite practical. It involves paying attention to your dreams, your fantasies, your spontaneous thoughts and images. It involves asking yourself, what is this part of me trying to say? What does it need? How can I honor it without letting it take over my life? Third, Jung emphasized the importance of finding meaning in your suffering. This doesn't mean glorifying pain or staying stuck in dysfunction. It means recognizing that your crisis has a purpose. It's trying to move you towards something better, something more authentic, something more aligned with who you really are. Fourth, Jung recognized that this process often requires support, not necessarily therapy, though that can be helpful, but some form of witness, some person or community that can hold space for your transformation without trying to fix you or talk you out of it. Someone who can remind you that what you're experiencing is normal, even necessary. And fifth, Jung emphasized patience. Individuation doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong process. There will be setbacks, regression, moments when you feel like you're back where you started. This is normal. Growth isn't linear. It's cyclical, spiral, sometimes chaotic. So what does life look like on the other side of this process? What happens when you've done the work, faced the crisis, integrated the shadow, and connected with your authentic self? Jung would tell you that you don't arrive at some final destination of perfect wholeness. Instead, you develop what he called a different relationship with yourself and the world. You stop making decisions based primarily on other people's expectations. You start trusting your own inner guidance. You become more comfortable with uncertainty, with not having all the answers, with being a work in progress. You develop what Jung called a religious attitude toward life, not necessarily religious in the traditional sense, but a sense of reverence for the mystery of existence, for the process of becoming. You also develop what Jung called a different relationship with suffering. Instead of seeing crisis as something to be avoided at all costs, you recognize it as potentially transformative. You don't seek out pain, but you don't run from it either. You understand that some of life's most important lessons come wrapped in difficulty. Perhaps most importantly, you develop what Jung called authentic relationships. Instead of connecting with people based on mutual ego needs or social expectations, you connect from your true self to theirs. These relationships are often fewer in number, but deeper in quality. They're based on genuine compatibility rather than convenience or comfort. You also develop a different relationship with your work, your creativity, your contribution to the world. Instead of working primarily for external validation or material gain, you start working from a sense of calling, of authentic expression, of service to something larger than yourself. This doesn't mean you become impractical or irresponsible. It means your motivations shift from external to internal. But let me be clear about something. This process isn't easy. It's not a self-help quick fix or a spiritual bypass. It requires genuine courage because it involves facing aspects of yourself and your life that you've been avoiding. It requires genuine commitment because it's a lifelong process, not a one-time event. And it requires genuine faith because you have to trust the process even when you can't see where it's leading. The path of individuation will likely cost you some things. You might lose relationships that were based on your old persona. You might have to make career changes that don't make sense to other people. You might have to disappoint people who preferred your old, more predictable self. You might have to spend time alone, in uncertainty, in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. But Jung would tell you that these losses are necessary for what you'll gain. You'll gain authenticity. You'll gain a sense of purpose that comes from within rather than from external sources. You'll gain resilience because you'll know you can survive psychological crisis and emerge stronger. You'll gain wisdom because you'll understand the deeper patterns of human development. Most importantly, you'll gain what Jung called a sense of wholeness. Not perfection. Jung was clear that wholeness includes our flaws, our contradictions, our ongoing struggles. But a sense of completeness, of being fully yourself, of no longer hiding from or being ashamed of who you are. This is why Jung believed that psychological crisis should be welcomed rather than feared. It's the call to adventure, the invitation to become who you really are. It's uncomfortable, yes. It's challenging, absolutely. But it's also the most important work you'll ever do. So if you're in the midst of a quarter-life crisis, feeling lost and uncertain about your direction, know that this confusion is not a problem to be solved quickly. It's a developmental stage to be navigated thoughtfully. If you're experiencing a midlife crisis, feeling like everything you've built is suddenly meaningless, know that this isn't failure. It's evolution. And if you're facing what feels like a psychological breakdown, remember Jung's words. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Sometimes becoming who you are requires breaking down who you thought you were supposed to be. The crisis that's changing your life forever isn't happening to you. It's happening for you. It's your psyche's way of guiding you toward authenticity, toward wholeness, toward the life you're actually meant to live. Trust the process. Trust yourself. Trust that on the other side of this crisis, you'll find not just relief, but transformation. The question isn't whether you'll face psychological crisis in your life. The question is whether you'll have the courage to let it change you. Jung believed that this courage, the courage to face yourself, to question everything, to let go of who you thought you were in service of who you actually are, is the most important courage of all. And in a world that often values conformity over authenticity, comfort over growth, and certainty over truth, choosing individuation is a radical act. It's the decision to stop living someone else's life and start living your own. It's the decision to stop being who you think you should be and start being who you are. The crisis that will change your life forever isn't waiting for you in the future. It's here now, in this moment of recognition. in this decision to stop running from yourself and start running toward yourself. Jung would tell you that this crisis is not your enemy, it's your calling, and the life waiting for you on the other side is more beautiful, more authentic, and more yours than anything you could have imagined. Are you ready to answer the call?